Here's something that should break your brain a little. For 95% of human existence, the word job didn't exist. Not the concept, not the word, not even a rough translation of it. No boss, no paycheck, no Monday. And yet somehow, humans survived, raised children, built tools, painted on cave walls, and passed down knowledge across thousands of generations, without anyone ever going to work. So here's the question that should actually bother you. If there was no job, no schedule, no boss telling anyone what to do, what were people doing with their time all day, every day, for hundreds of thousands of years? The instinctive answer is surviving, constantly, exhaustingly, from sunrise to sunset, in a grinding fight against starvation. That's the image most of us carry. Hunched figures scraping by, one bad week from death, every waking hour spent chasing food. Except that picture is mostly wrong. And the real answer is stranger, and honestly a little uncomfortable, because it suggests we haven't upgraded our lives so much as rearranged our chains. Let's start with the assumption everyone gets wrong, that ancient life was an endless grind. In the 1960s, anthropologist Marshall Salins studied hunter-gatherer societies like the Juhoansi of the Kalahari Desert and found something that upended the whole picture. These groups spent roughly 15 to 20 hours a week on subsistence activities, hunting, gathering, tool maintenance. Not 15 to 20 hours a day, a week. Compare that to the average modern work week, and hunter-gatherers come out looking less like desperate survivors and more like people with an enormous amount of leisure time on their hands. Salins gave this idea a name that stuck: the original affluent society. Not affluent because they had more stuff, but because they wanted less, and the gap between what they needed and what they had was small enough to close in an afternoon. But if they weren't spending all day hunting mammoths, what were they actually doing with the other 7+ hours? Here's where it gets interesting. A huge amount of that time went into things that don't look like work at all by modern standards, but were absolutely essential. Social maintenance, grooming, storytelling, arguing, teaching children, resolving disputes, singing, dancing around a fire late into the night. Anthropologists studying the Hadza in Tanzania have documented that a significant portion of daily life is spent in unstructured social contact, sitting together, talking, doing nothing that produces an obvious output. In a world without written language, without email, without a way to store information anywhere except inside another person's head, sitting around telling stories wasn't idle time. It was the entire information infrastructure of the group. Every myth, every survival lesson, every piece of local knowledge about which plants were poisonous or which watering hole dried up in a drought, all of it lived in conversation, and conversation took hours. Now, here's the part nobody talks about. Tool making and maintenance weren't a job either. They were something closer to a hobby that also happened to keep you alive. Knapping a stone tool, weaving a net, fletching an arrow, these tasks were done communally, often while talking, often by multiple generations sitting together, the way you might do a puzzle or tend a garden today. There was no foreman checking whether the spear was finished by 5 p.m. There was no concept of clocking in. The task got done when it got done, and the doing of it was woven into the same stretch of time as gossip, childcare, and rest. And rest is the piece that gets glossed over the most. Modern humans are chronically sleep-deprived and treat downtime as something you have to earn. Hunter-gatherer groups, by contrast, appear to have had extraordinary amounts of unstructured downtime, napping in the shade during the hottest part of the day, lounging, people-watching, doing nothing in particular for hours. Researchers studying sleep patterns among groups like the Hadza and the San have found their sleep is often lighter and more broken up than ours, but their daytime is also punctuated with far more rest breaks than modern work schedules simply allow for. There was no manager to notice you'd stopped producing. Productivity, as a concept that governs your worth and your time, didn't exist yet. There's a fourth layer too, one that rarely gets mentioned: play. Not just for children, for adults as well. Anthropological accounts of foraging societies describe adults wrestling, gambling with simple games of chance using bones or seeds, competing in mock hunts, and inventing music with nothing but sticks, voices, and rhythm. Play wasn't a reward earned after real work was finished. It was simply part of the day, folded in wherever there was a lull, the same way breathing happens whether or not you're paying attention to it. There was no separate category in the mind called leisure that had to be unlocked. Life didn't have a productivity tab and a fun tab. It was one undivided stretch of time. There's also a fifth layer, and it might be the most surprising one. Art and ritual weren't hobbies squeezed into spare hours either. They consumed serious time and effort, for no material payoff at all. Consider the cave paintings at Lascaux and Chauvet in France, dated to tens of thousands of years ago, some requiring scaffolding, ground pigment, and firelight to complete deep inside dark chambers. Nobody was paid to make them. Nobody needed them to survive the winter. And yet entire days, sometimes entire seasons, were poured into creating them, alongside body ornamentation, burial rituals, and elaborate ceremonies documented at sites across the world. This wasn't a species squeezing meaning out of the margins of a brutal existence. Meaning-making was the main event, running in parallel with subsistence, not competing with it for scraps of time. Here's the layer that connects it to something bigger. Division of labor existed, but not as a rigid job category. A skilled tracker might track today and gather tomorrow. A skilled toolmaker might spend 1 week almost entirely on tools and the next almost entirely on childcare. Roles shifted with skill, mood, season, and need, not with a title stamped on a contract. Archaeological evidence, including grave goods and tool distribution patterns at sites in places like the Dordogne region of France, suggests specialization existed even in deep prehistory. Some people were clearly better flint knappers, better artists, better trackers than others. But that specialization flowed with ability and circumstance, not with a fixed role you were locked into for 40 years. This is where the job, as we understand it, starts to look less like an ancient inevitability and more like a genuinely recent invention. Agriculture changed everything, starting roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Once humans settled into farming, the workload didn't just increase, it became relentless and seasonal, tied to crop cycles rather than personal energy or social rhythm. Skeletal evidence from early agricultural populations, studied at sites across the Fertile Crescent, shows increased signs of physical stress, malnutrition, and shorter stature compared to earlier hunter-gatherer populations. Evidence that settling down and working the land may have actually made health worse in the short term, even as it enabled larger populations and, eventually, civilization itself. The job, in the modern sense, a fixed role, a fixed schedule, a wage paid by someone else who owns your labor, is even younger still. Most historians trace the wage labor structure most of us live inside today to the Industrial Revolution, just a couple hundred years old. In evolutionary terms, that's not even a blink. If human existence were compressed into a single 24-hour day, the modern 9-to-5 job would occupy the final few seconds before midnight. So the real answer isn't that ancient humans were lazy, or that they were somehow more enlightened than us. It's that the entire architecture of work as a separate, dominant, identity-defining category of life is a historical accident of agriculture and industry, not a fixed feature of being human. For nearly the entire span of our species' existence, subsistence, social bonding, skill building, storytelling, play, art, and rest weren't separate categories competing for hours in a day. They were the same continuous fabric of living. And here's the part that connects back to you, sitting there right now, probably reading this on a break from something you're supposed to be doing. Your ancestors didn't have a work-life balance problem, because work and life had never been split apart in the first place. There was no boundary to balance, no calendar app quietly judging how you spent your hours, no invisible manager keeping score of your worth. What you're feeling, the exhaustion of constantly switching between productive and not productive, the guilt of resting, the sense that your value is measured in output, isn't some ancient survival instinct misfiring in the modern world. It's the opposite. It's a brand new invention, barely a few hundred years old, dressed up to look like it's always been this way, like it's simply how humans are built. Somewhere underneath all of it, though, the same nervous system that once knew how to sit by a fire for hours, doing nothing in particular, telling stories, painting on stone by firelight, is still in there, quietly unconvinced by the calendar. It didn't evolve to clock in. It evolved to belong.